Imagine waking up, not in your own bed, but in a place that feels alien, a place that is alien because it is not your own body. You are a passenger, a grotesque ornament grafted onto another living being. Your eyes open, and you see the world from a familiar height, but every command your brain sends to your limbs is met with silence. You try to move, to stand, to run, but you have no legs, no torso, no arms. You exist only from the shoulders up. Below you, you feel the rhythmic breathing, the warmth, the pulse of another creature, another dog. You are a head, a living, thinking, feeling head, crudely stitched onto the neck of a larger, bewildered animal who now carries you as a parasitic twin. You are thirsty. You see a bowl of milk, and with a desperate primal instinct, you lap at it. The cool liquid soothes your tongue for a moment, and then it spills from the severed, open end of your esophagus, dribbling down the fur of your host. You can drink, but you can never quench your thirst. This is not a scene from a fever dream or a horror film. This was a documented, celebrated, and repeated reality in a Soviet laboratory in the 1950s. What kind of mind could conceive of such a thing? And for what purpose could such an excruciating existence ever be justified? To understand the two-headed dogs, you must first understand the man who created them and the world that created him. Vladimir Petrovich Demikhov was not a monster in the conventional sense. He was a brilliant surgeon, a visionary, and a product of a uniquely brutal and ambitious time. Born in 1916, his youth was forged in the crucible of the new Soviet Union, a state built on the promise of radical transformation and scientific utopianism. He came of age in a system that lionized progress above all else, where the individual, be it human or animal, was secondary to the glorious advancement of the collective state. After serving as a forensic pathologist during the Second World War, witnessing firsthand the fragility and mechanics of the body, Demikhov became obsessed with a single, revolutionary idea: the ability to transplant vital organs. In an era when such a concept was pure science fiction, when the body was seen as an inviolable, integrated whole, Demikhov envisioned it as a collection of replaceable parts. The system that governed his world, the relentless ideological pressure of the Cold War, provided both the opportunity and the justification for his methods. In the great race against the West, every scientific first was a political victory, a testament to the superiority of the communist system. There was no ethics committee to appeal to, no public outcry to fear. There was only the mandate to achieve the impossible, and Demikhov, with his chilling focus and surgical genius, was the perfect instrument for the task. His laboratory on the outskirts of Moscow was less a state-of-the-art facility and more a grim, functional workshop of flesh and steel. It was here, with rudimentary tools and a shoestring budget, that Demikhov began his systematic deconstruction of life's limits. His early work, while less sensational than what was to come, was no less audacious. In 1946, long before the world was ready for it, he performed the first successful canine heart transplant. A dog, its own heart removed, lived for 5 hours with the heart of another beating in its chest. It was a staggering achievement, a flicker of possibility in a field shrouded in impossibility. He followed this with the first lung transplant, and then, in a feat of astonishing surgical dexterity, the first ever heart-lung transplant in 1947. These were not sterile, clean procedures as we imagine them today. They were frantic, bloody affairs, driven by Demikhov's almost inhuman speed and precision. He developed revolutionary techniques for suturing blood vessels, creating stable connections that were the key to keeping the transplanted organs viable. Yet the subjects of these triumphs, the dogs themselves, invariably died within days, succumbing to infection or the mysterious and then unknown force of organ rejection. For Demikhov, their deaths were not failures but data points, necessary sacrifices on the altar of progress. Each death was a lesson, each carcass a stepping stone. The progression of his work reveals a mind unbound by conventional ethics, a mind that saw the body as a machine to be reconfigured. If he could transplant a heart, a lung, a kidney, why not a more complex system? Why not the seat of consciousness itself? This was the chilling logic that led him from organ replacement to the creation of his chimeras. The two-headed dog experiments, which began in earnest in the early 1950s, were the ultimate expression of his surgical philosophy. They were not, in his view, an act of cruelty, but a demonstration of mastery. He sought to prove that a head with its brain, its personality, its senses, could be kept alive purely by the circulatory system of a host body, completely detached from its own. The procedure he developed was a masterpiece of surgical brutality. He would select two dogs, a large, sturdy host, typically a German shepherd, and a smaller donor puppy or mongrel. The smaller dog would be the one to suffer the ultimate violation. Demikhov would make a series of incisions, severing the animal's body just below the forelegs, meticulously ligating vessels to control the bleeding. The spine was cut, the chest cavity discarded. What remained was a living head, a pair of front paws, and a truncated upper torso containing a heart and lungs that were, for the moment, still functioning. This dismembered creature was then grafted onto the host. Demikhov would slice open the neck of the larger dog, exposing the carotid artery and jugular vein. In a blur of motion, using surgical staplers of his own invention, he would connect the vessels from the donor's partial body to the host's circulatory system. The host dog's heart would now pump blood not only to its own brain, but to the brain of the second head as well. Once the connection was secure and blood was flowing, Demikhov would complete the procedure, severing the donor's own heart and lungs, removing them entirely. The second head was now fully parasitic, a sentient appendage kept alive by the biological machinery of another. He performed this grotesque operation 23 times, each experiment a slight variation on the theme, each one ending in the same inevitable tragedy. The creatures he created were unsettling paradoxes of life and death, existing in a state of perpetual confusion and distress. Chroniclers who visited his lab reported seeing the two heads acting independently. The host head would be passive and weary, while the smaller, grafted head would often be more alert, perhaps because it was younger. It would yawn, bark, and attempt to play, its paws flailing uselessly in the air. The two heads would sometimes interact, the larger one snapping irritably at the smaller one, or the smaller one attempting to lick the face of its host. The longest any of these tormented creatures survived was 29 days. Most perished within a week. Let us slow down and witness the climax of this scientific horror story, focusing on the most famous and well-documented of these experiments, which took place in 1954. A film crew was present, capturing the event for the purposes of Soviet propaganda, unwittingly creating a permanent record of calculated suffering. The subjects were chosen: a large, placid German shepherd mix named Brodiaga, or Vagrant, would be the host. The donor was a smaller, lighter-colored mongrel named Shavka. The operating theater was stark, illuminated by harsh overhead lamps that glinted off stainless steel instruments. There was no sense of reverence, only a cold, mechanical purpose. The air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the chemical bite of antiseptic. Demikhov and his team worked with a chilling efficiency, a well-oiled machine of dismemberment and reconstruction. The first act of the drama was the methodical vivisection of Shavka. She was anesthetized, her small body strapped to a table. The surgeon's scalpel moved with practiced speed, slicing through skin and muscle. The first incision ran around her chest, just behind the front legs. Blood welled up and was quickly sponged away. One by one, the vital connections to her lower body were severed. The aorta, the vena cava, the spinal columnal were cut. Her lower torso and hind legs, now just a piece of meat, were discarded. What remained on the table was a grotesque, living fragment, a head, neck, shoulders and front paws, kept alive for a few precious minutes by its own frantically beating heart. Now, the host dog, Brodiaga, was brought to the table. An incision was made in his powerful neck, a deep trough carved into the muscle to expose the throbbing carotid artery and the deep blue of the jugular vein. The preparations were complete. The second act began. The grotesque union, the severed upper body of Shavka, was lifted and carefully positioned onto the back of Brodiaga, just above his shoulders. The true genius and horror of Demikhov's technique was now on display. He had to create a shared circulatory system. Using a needle and fine thread, he began the painstaking process of anastomosis, the suturing of blood vessel to blood vessel. The carotid of Shavka was stitched to the carotid of Brodiaga, the jugular to the jugular. It was a delicate, bloody ballet, a dance of life support. Finally, he connected their vertebral columns with a plastic brace to provide some stability. The final, brutal step was to stop Shavka's own heart, rendering her completely dependent on Brodiaga. The graft was complete. The two dogs were now one creature. The true psychological torment began upon waking. Brodiaga, the host, awoke first. He was groggy, confused, and burdened by a heavy, unfamiliar weight on his neck. He tried to shake it off, but it was part of him now, a living, breathing appendage. A few minutes later, the second head, Shavka, regained consciousness. Her eyes fluttered open. Imagine her terror. Her mind was intact. She could see, hear, and feel, but her body was gone. She was trapped, a prisoner in a cell made of another's flesh. The film footage from that day is profoundly disturbing. It shows the two heads, one weary and burdened, the other alert and terrified. A lab assistant offered Shavka a bowl of milk. Driven by instinct, she eagerly lapped at it, the liquid providing a fleeting moment of comfort before cascading out of the open stump of her esophagus, wetting the fur of her host. She could perform the act of drinking, but could never receive its benefit. Brodiaga, meanwhile, was also offered water, and he drank deeply, his body providing sustenance for both brains. In one bizarre moment, the film shows Shavka's head snapping at Brodiaga's, a flash of panicked aggression from the parasitic head toward its unwitting life support system. For 4 days, this monstrous creation lived. 4 days of shared existence, of confused pain and parasitic dependence. It was a spectacle of life, but a mockery of living. The end for Brodiaga and Shavka was as grim and inevitable as their creation. They survived for only 4 days. The cause of death, as in nearly all of Demikhov's head transplant experiments, was a catastrophic failure of biology. While Demikhov had masterfully solved the plumbing problem, connecting the vessels with surgical brilliance, he could not defeat the far more complex and subtle enemy, the immune system. Brodiaga's body, from the moment of the graft, recognized Shavka's head as a foreign invader. An invisible war was being waged at the cellular level. White blood cells, the soldiers of the immune system, flooded the site of the union, attacking the foreign tissue in a process known as tissue rejection. The site of the sutures became inflamed, swollen, and septic. The delicate connections between the blood vessels, Demikhov's proudest achievement, began to fail. A nerve in Brodiaga's neck was accidentally damaged during the procedure, a small error with devastating consequences, leading to the eventual collapse of the entire system. The corpse of the two-headed dog was a silent testament to this biological warfare. The flesh around the graft was discolored and necrotic, already beginning the process of decay. The once alert head of Shavka was now limp and lifeless, a gruesome trophy on the body of her deceased host. The entire creature, a marvel of surgical ambition, had become a single, unified piece of dead matter. There was no respectful burial, no acknowledgement of the suffering endured. The bodies were simply raw material for further study. They were dissected, analyzed, and catalogued. The reactions of observers at the time were a strange mix of awe and revulsion. Within the Soviet Union, the propaganda machine spun the experiment as a triumph of communist science. The film was distributed as proof of Soviet ingenuity, a clear signal to the West that no frontier was beyond their reach. They had created life where it did not exist before. They had bent the laws of nature to their will. For the scientists and journalists from the West who were granted rare access to Demikhov's lab, the experience was profoundly unsettling. They saw the undeniable surgical skill, the sheer audacity of the attempt. They were witnessing the birth of a new field of science, transplantology. Yet, they could not escape the fundamental horror of what they were seeing. The whimpering, the confusion of the animal, the sheer unnaturalness of the creature stood in stark contrast to the proud, clinical explanations of its creator. Demikhov himself seemed largely unmoved by the suffering. To him, these were not pets, they were biological specimens, temporary solutions to complex technical problems. The death of the two-headed dog was not a tragedy, it was simply the end of one experiment and the impetus to begin the next. What, then, is the legacy of Vladimir Demikhov and his legion of tormented dogs? It is a legacy steeped in a profound and disturbing irony. On one hand, he is rightfully remembered as a figure of scientific horror, a man whose ambition led him to commit acts of spectacular cruelty. The image of the two-headed dog remains one of the most potent symbols of science untethered from ethics, of progress pursued at any cost. His work was a direct product of the Soviet system's demand for grandiose gestures, for scientific theater that could be weaponized in the Cold War. The suffering of his animal subjects was rendered invisible, a mere footnote in the grand narrative of national prestige. Demikhov was the state's willing surgeon, and his operating table was a stage for ideological warfare. Yet, to dismiss him as merely a monster is to miss the more complicated and uncomfortable truth. He was, undeniably, a pioneer. The techniques he perfected through these grotesque experiments, the methods for suturing blood vessels, the management of blood flow to transplanted organs, the very concept of keeping a complex organ alive on a new host were revolutionary. The ultimate irony is that the world's first successful human-to-human heart transplant would not have been possible without the foundational work of the man who sewed dog heads together. In 1967, the South African surgeon Christian Barnard shocked the world by performing that landmark operation. Years earlier, Barnard had made 2 pilgrimages to Demikhov's humble Moscow laboratory. He watched the master at work, observing his speed, his precision, his innovative use of surgical staplers and vessel suturing techniques. Barnard later admitted, "If there is a father of heart and lung transplantation, then Demikhov is that man." He called him one of the greatest unsung pioneers of the 20th century. This is the unsettling core of Demikhov's story. The life-saving procedures that we now take for granted, the operations that have granted tens of thousands of people a second chance at life, were built upon a foundation of almost unimaginable animal suffering. The screams of the dogs in that Moscow lab echo, however faintly, in every modern transplant ward. Demikhov himself, however, did not share in the glory. While Barnard became an international celebrity, Demikhov was increasingly sidelined by the Soviet scientific establishment. His work was deemed too controversial, too sensational, and he was denied funding and eventually faded into obscurity, dying in 1998, a forgotten footnote in the history he helped create. His story is a chilling reminder that the path to medical breakthroughs is often not a clean, linear progression, but a messy, morally compromised, and sometimes brutal journey. We are left, then, with the unsettling image that began our story, the 2 heads, 1 body, a creature of profound confusion and pain. It forces us to confront the true cost of knowledge. Demikhov's work represents a critical moment in scientific history, the point where, can we, brutally overpowered, Should we? He pushed the boundaries of the possible, but in doing so, he trampled over the ethical lines that separate inquiry from atrocity. His story is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a timeless, cautionary tale that echoes powerfully in our own era. We live in a time of unprecedented scientific advancement, from the mapping of the human genome to the development of artificial intelligence and the controversial prospect of human cloning, or even, as proposed by some contemporary surgeons, human head transplants. The ghost of Demikhov looms over these modern frontiers. His work serves as a stark reminder that scientific capability is not its own justification. The pursuit of knowledge, if unchecked by compassion and a profound respect for the sanctity of life, can lead to monstrous outcomes. The pressure to be the first, whether for national prestige, corporate profit, or personal glory, can create systems that incentivize reckless and unethical behavior, just as the Cold War did for Demikhov. The two-headed dogs were not merely a scientific experiment, they were a moral statement. They demonstrated that a biological organism could be kept technically alive, even when the fundamental essence of its being, its autonomy, its integrity, its ability to live without constant, confusing torment had been destroyed. They force us to ask a question that is more relevant today than ever. What does it truly mean to be alive? And what price are we willing to pay for progress? Every time a new technology offers to reshape the boundaries of life, we must remember the dogs in that Moscow lab. We must remember that the line between a visionary pioneer and a creator of nightmares is perilously thin, and that the greatest advancements are worth nothing if we sacrifice our humanity to achieve them. The story of Vladimir Demikhov is not just about what one man did to a few dozen dogs. It is about the darkness that can fester within the noble pursuit of knowledge and the terrifying ease with which we can justify cruelty in the name of the future.